I'd like to, in this short presentation, I'd like to look at a handful of the arguments that are found on the website godisimaginary.com. There's 50 arguments that are presented, 50 articles that are presented that present a series of different sorts of reasons to reject belief in God, and in particular there's an attack on the Christian faith. I've been responding to these and spending one video or one 10-15 minute segment for each of the arguments up to now. There has been a certain amount of repetition in some of the arguments, and some of the arguments are shorter than others. And so what I've done here is I've gathered up several of the arguments, and I think that they're short enough and they're easy enough to respond to that we can deal with several of them at once. In the remaining arguments that I haven't dealt with, there'll be about 15 left after this presentation. The ones that are longer and more substantial, I'll continue to spend one video on those. But the first argument I'd like to look at here is the 34th argument, which is entitled "Examine Your Health Insurance Policy." And the argument, the reason why I don't want to spend the whole time on this particular argument is because it's the same thing that we've seen a number of times in respect to, if you have an insurance policy that allows you to go to the doctor or get medical care, why do you even need that if, in fact, Jesus promises that He'll answer prayers and that God will answer prayers? Why do you need medical attention if, in fact, God is there to answer all of these prayers? And in response to that, I would say some of the things that I've said in prior videos, and you can go back and take a look at those for more extensive answers to these kinds of arguments. But I would only raise a couple of issues. One is that when we think about prayer and we think about the fragile nature of our health as human beings, I just recently went to the doctor for an annual physical. And one of the things that I experience, and I suspect some of you do as well, is that when I go for a physical or when I have some type of physical ailment, one of the things that crosses my mind is my mortality, how weak and fragile our humanity is, how weak and fragile our bodies are. And this is, I think, an important lesson to be learned from our illnesses and from the fact that we seek out medical care. It reminds us that this life is transitory, that this body is not made to endure forever in its present condition. And I think both the atheist and the Christian can agree with that the human body is simply not capable of enduring forever under its current condition and under its current structure. We're unable to live forever. And as a Christian, that is in fact one of the lessons that we learn from the fact that we seek out medical care. Now, of course, we believe that the human intellect is a great gift from God, and that we have been endowed with intellect in order to learn about our world and to learn to harness its powers and to solve its problems. And so the human intellect is in fact a divine gift, and therefore medical attention is a gift from God as well. But I think one of the great lessons we can learn from this is that God doesn't cure all of our ailments, and God doesn't take care of all of our problems in this world in the sense of causing us to live forever now in our current condition, precisely because this is not our final step in this journey. This life is transitory, and it is passing away. And the Bible teaches that, and therefore we do not expect all of our illnesses to be cured. We seek out medical care because God has nowhere promised that all of our physical ailments will be taken care of. Indeed, even the apostles and writers of Scripture are people that struggled with physical ailments and even suffered and died, which is the ultimate effect of living in this kind of world and in this kind of body that we're experiencing now. And nowhere does the Bible promise that all physical ailments will be cured all the time. In any case, you can go back and see other presentations where we discuss similar issues, but as a Christian, I look at our ongoing need of physical care, and then the slow decaying of the body as signs that this world is not our final step, and that it is a part of a transition, we believe, to a higher kind of reality. Of course, for the atheist, this is the end of the story. But in any case, we can both, I think, agree that the current state of our bodies is not our final one. The 35th argument that's offered on the website godisimaginary.com is entitled, "Notice Jesus' myopia." And the way the argument goes is something like this. Jesus could have done so much more than what he did. He could have brought an end to sexism, racism, and slavery, several of the issues that keep coming up in these presentations. Jesus could have solved those. Instead, what does he do? He goes around dealing with relatively insignificant problems. He goes around, sort of healing people's ailments that don't really cure any fundamental problem that human beings have. And so Jesus, if we're to take him as some type of revelation from God, or the incarnation of God, as Christianity professes, then it seems as if Jesus sure didn't have a very big picture of things according to this argument. In response to that, I would say several things. One is that actually, if we come to look at carefully at the effects of Jesus' teachings and the faith in Jesus that was the effect of his life and of the Christian faith, I think a very powerful argument can be made that Christian civilization and Christian influence has brought an increasing attention to those kinds of questions. The very fact that we deal with those issues, I think, is a working out of the consistent application of various principles that Christians hold forth, like, for example, that both male and female are created in the image of God, and so on. And so these kinds of issues that are deeply embedded in human history, issues pertaining to equality of men and women and sexism and so on, racism and slavery, all of these are issues that slowly come into the conscious awareness of the human family, but not out of nowhere. They come into our consciousness as an effect of certain principles and insights into human nature and the value of human life and so on. And so I think a very good argument can be made that the very fact that we in our world are asking these sorts of questions and deal with these kinds of issues, it arises from within the human spirit, but the human spirit as affected and guided by principles and insights that we find in the Christian scriptures. Another thing I would say is that Jesus in his ministry comes to deal with very fundamental root problems of the human experience. Jesus didn't come just to bring some kind of teaching about racism or sexism or whatever, because Jesus could have taught things that people didn't care to listen to, and there would have been no difference or there would have been no change. Jesus comes to deal with the deeper problem of the human spirit, of human sinfulness, of human waywardness, our movement away from God. And the closer we get to God, and the more we learn of God, and the more we learn of the way of God, the more we can learn how to deal with these problems of the human spirit. The most fantastic thing about the life of Jesus is not any isolated moment in his teachings or in his miracles or whatever, but the most fantastic thing we can learn from the ministry of Jesus is that God, if in fact Jesus is God incarnate and God present with us and speaking to us, what we learn through Jesus is that God loves the human family, and that the human family is valuable, and that the human family should be cared for. And if God would come down to our level and care for us through Christ, even giving himself on the cross, then that gives incredible value to human beings and to human life. And so that kind of value placed upon human beings, as we find it in the scriptures, I think is a much more powerful thing than any particular teaching that could have easily been forgotten and lost in history with people that don't want to listen to that. So I would suggest to the atheist who thinks these kinds of thoughts that actually God, through Christ, has addressed these kinds of issues in a much more lasting and profound way by reaching to the root question, which is, why is human life valuable to begin with? The atheist, I think, even if they might value these types of principles, like the abolition of slavery or abolition of sexism and that sort of thing, even if they really value those sorts of things, they don't have sufficient intellectual underpinnings for their argument against those kinds of practices. Another atheist could easily say, well, based on the principles of evolutionary struggle for survival, I think the strongest should be should defeat the weaker, and it doesn't matter about race, or these kinds of things are not to be valued. And I don't think the atheist has a sufficient response to these kinds of challenges. So, as a Christian, I can agree that there are certain social ills and evils that we should overcome and that we should work against, but I don't think the atheist has the right answer to the question, and I think the way the scriptures are being approached is expecting them to deal with the problem in a certain way, whereas the Bible deals with it, I think, in a more lasting, a more permanent, and a more effective way. And so those are my brief thoughts to that. And I would also say that we could take the writings. I have a collection of the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. just as an example of this. You can't read through his various sermons and his various writings without seeing how deeply and profoundly influenced he was by Christian theology to lead a kind of nonviolent movement against segregation and racial discrimination. So Christian principles have been deeply influential in this process. Now let me move to one other argument very quickly, maybe two, just have a little bit of time left, but let me maybe throw out two more arguments. One of them is proof number 37, which is entitled Think About DNA. And the argument basically goes like this. Evolution produced DNA, which is that, what is usually called that information that sort of is replicated and and that drives and guides the cell reproduction and in various living organisms, and that the amount of information is contained in a single cell, so far as the organization of that material and the processing of that information. These processes and the amount of data or information that runs every cell in the human body, and I think there's some trillion cells in the human body, that all of that data, that information that's running us right now is an enormous amount of stored material, an enormously complex process that's working there. And so the way the argument goes here is that if we admit that evolution is the process by which DNA has come about, then we can't also make the argument that God is necessary in order to explain DNA. This particular argument is a hodgepodge of different points and different perspectives and arguments that are being used here. And I think there's a fundamental problem with the way the argument is set up here. The argument is if evolution is the process by which DNA has come about, then there is no room for God, or there is no need for God. I think that is an arbitrary and unnecessary dichotomy between these two things. I can argue that God is working through the process of the evolutionary process. God is working through that, and that God at certain important stages in that process may infuse or elevate the creation by the infusion of information, or which is not taking up space. It's not the insertion of some new physical property in the world, but it's the guiding of the world to have the essential information that will direct the process of evolution. So I can believe in a divinely guiding hand that moves the evolutionary process, and so it doesn't have to be an either-or scenario. And I think it's more plausible to believe that there is a guiding hand in the evolutionary process, but there also is an element of randomness in that process, in the sense of a sort of unexpectedness that accompanies the evolutionary process along the way. So I think it's not just God or the evolutionary process, it's God working through and alongside of and in the midst of that process. And then finally, maybe if I could take a stab at one more quick one, and that is argument number 38, which is entitled The Divorce Rate Among Christians. And the essence of the argument is the Christian divorce rate, despite the fact that the Scriptures speak about the sacredness of marriage and the importance of the marital commitment, the statistics suggest that the divorce rate among Christians is about as high or equal to the non-Christian population. And the conclusion from that is, the strange conclusion from that is, that God therefore does not exist. It's a rather silly conclusion. There are lots of other alternatives besides God doesn't exist. It could be that the numbers are skewed by the fact that there are a lot of non-practicing Christians that are included in that number, people who may call themselves a Christian but not really practice their faith. I don't think it's fair to hold those who claim the Christian name in name only but don't practice it or don't know about it or don't live out its meaning. I don't think that that's the right way to go about looking at this. Furthermore, I think that even if every Christian in the world were inconsistent on this point, or didn't live out their faith fully or completely on this point, even if the accusation is true that Christians are not being faithful on this point, it still doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. It just proves that Christians are not being consistent about their faith. And I think also there are other things to point at, like social issues that are influencing Christians, poor understanding of marriage, unfortunate preparation for marriage, a very low regard for marriage in the culture in general. There are all kinds of possible explanations, but none of these imply or necessarily infer that God doesn't exist, even if every Christian is imperfect and unfaithful in fully living out their faith. There's a lot more to be said about all of these arguments, but I'm about out of time, and just thought I would suggest ways of moving forward on each of these from a Christian perspective.